Hi, welcome to Artis Vivendi, the craft of living. My name is Ante Jurancic. So today I would like to introduce this channel a bit more by telling you a little bit about my background, specifically one thing that happened to me in the past that shaped me. Now, I believe that stories are incredibly important. Stories explain both where we are coming from, but they also explain reasons and factors why it is that certain things move us, certain things excite us, and how does our cognition really work. So I believe that situating some of my interests within some autobiographical elements might actually be of help to you and to understand what this channel is all about. I was converted into a very, I would say, fundamentalist type of Christianity. Now, I don't want to say that every single person was a fundamentalist. That was actually not the case. But there definitely was a fundamentalist streak to that whole experience. Just as an example, people in my congregation where I started attending, they would not, at least some of them would not shave on Sabbath or shower on the Sabbath. Certainly, if we as young people would go through the town, some of the older people would say, do not look at the display windows, that would be shopping sort of with your mind and all of that, and that we shouldn't do that on the Sabbath. So that was a very strict environment into which I got converted. I got converted in the context of socialist Yugoslavia. We lived in Yugoslavia at that time, a socialist country. And although the country was way more open towards religion than what you had in other countries of the Eastern Bloc. Actually, we had a lot of liberties. We were able to travel all around the world. It was a very different environment than, for instance, what you had in Romania or some of the other countries in terms of strictures that the Communist Party imposed on its people. But religion was not encouraged, for sure. It was frowned upon, it was put down. So if you went to a bookstore, you wouldn't be able to find a lot of religious books. There were a couple of Catholic books, perhaps, and stuff like that, but you couldn't really buy a lot of literature. And that led to a curious phenomenon, perhaps not that curious, but it led to the phenomenon that a lot of us, especially later on when I became a theology student, were on the lookout, were scouring for literature that was perhaps not specifically religious, but literature that was dealing with themes and issues that were germane to the religious experience. So any kind of literature that dealt with the meaning of life and purpose and these significant, deep existential questions, we found a lot of attraction to that. In some ways, that was, the best way to put it would be that they had a hue to them, a feel to them, a spark of the transcendent. Perhaps not speaking about God, but at least to some higher human values. And so I'm thinking about books like Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, or books by Erich Fromm, and even philosophy books. Because philosophy was not so much, at least for me as a teenager when I started buying these books, and I remember some of my first books were books by Plato, the Phaedo, and Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments. Those were some of the early books I bought and started reading as a teenager. Now, I didn't understand all of them, but these works somehow connected me to these deeper questions about existence. They led me to reflect upon the priorities of life, what is truth, what is the nature of knowledge, connecting me to questions of, again, the meaning of life and things like that. So I felt deeply attracted to that kind of literature. So here's the interesting phenomenon, right? On the one hand, you have this kid. I was 15, 16 at that time when I became a Christian, a practicing Seventh-day Adventist, who is very conservative, is very strict, the kind of person who would, not even laugh too much, but, read very serious, walking through town and reading my Bible. And I was really fully in. And rightly so. I'm not spoofing it. I'm not in any way laughing at that. It was a very sincere and deeply felt conversion, but definitely with a very sort of conservative cast to that. At the same time, that conversion experience leads to the opening of mind. No one ever told me. My pastor didn't tell me. My elders didn't tell me. The whole environment wasn't like that. It wasn't an anti-intellectual environment that would say, because you are now a conservative Christian, now you cannot read that kind of literature because that's going to poison your mind. No, no, no. There was a kind of a sense of liberty. Precisely because I had, the truth, I was now able to look out for morsels and reflections and echoes of truth in all kinds of different cultural domains, including literature and arts and philosophy and all of that. And that really shaped me as an individual. It shaped me in several different ways. First of all, it shaped me that for me, and I think I carry this for the rest of my life, that for me these disciplinary confinements, psychology, philosophy, theology, sociology, literature, art, that those were helpful and they enabled you perhaps to focus your educational goals and develop some sort of expertise. But I find these disciplinary divisions quite confining because I'm not interested so much in theology and I'm not interested so much in philosophy. I'm interested in questions. I'm interested in questions about life, questions about truth, these broad, fundamental, deep questions that have to do with human existence, existential questions. And so that is why I find it very attractive and very easy and very natural to move from discipline to discipline without much of a hiccup. So in my teaching, I can move from reading scripture verse to some new insights from neuroscience or behavioral psychology towards some philosophical insights and back to some spiritual literature and conclude this with a word of prayer. So for me, these kind of movements are very natural. And I think in this channel that I'm going to slowly develop over time, I think that is going to be certainly one characteristic that I will find a lot of different material in different contexts and with ease move between these various domains of human knowing. I think the second thing that I derived from that experience was that I have a very hard time understanding. I can understand it, but still have a hard time perhaps processing why is it that someone gets religion or gets Jesus becomes more narrower, that that person's interests become more confined, more constricted. As it is as if becoming more devout sucks out the intellectual oxygen out of the room, and now you have to show your devotion, let me put it that way, show your devotion by carrying your anti-intellectualism or the fact that you do not read any other literature besides scriptures and some selected spiritual books as a badge of spiritual honor. I'm not judging, and I can relate to those sentiments. I honor that fervor, but for me, this is quite alien to my experience, not my experience as a professor and a teacher, as an academic, but the experience of this young 15, 16-year-old kid who really, by becoming a Christian, who really experienced the fresh air of intellectual freedom and exploration and discovery of the world. So that for me is a little bit of a challenge to understand such closure of the Christian mind. And the third thing is, and I think I got this third thing from my professor at the University of Chicago, William Schweiker. He once made a statement, a provocative statement, and he said that any idiot can criticize, but it requires a refinement of mind to be able to find connections between unlikely sources. Now, that is probably, somewhat crassly put, and he meant it as a provocative statement. But there's something there that he's right, to note, namely that, it is easy to go and just knock down different schools of thought and different thinkers because you find some element that you don't agree with, and then, oh, this is bad stuff. But to find connections between, let's say, Nietzsche and Jesus, and between Jesus and Aristotle, and between Aristotle and some of the neo-Stoics, and whatever you want to have, and to connect all of that with, let's say, psychology and other domains of science. I mean, that requires perhaps a certain openness. And I don't want to put this in any sort of elitist sense, or in any way that, in a sense that people who are not inclined to think that way, that is something fundamentally wrong. It is just that these kind of connections are connections that are very attractive to me. And I believe that has to do perhaps also with, I would say, some personality proclivities that I have. And that is that perhaps my form of thinking is more stronger on this intuitive side, where I intuitively feel connections, rather than perhaps on the analytical side, where I go about dissecting and rejecting what is wrong. And that might be a failure of thinking, might be a failure of personality. But it kind of explains perhaps my attitudes and why I find so much joy in canvassing and bringing together insights that I find in different wisdom traditions and schools of thought. Now, I'm a Christian. I'm a professor of ethics and theology. I approach this from a certain space of deep commitment. This is not about dispersing my identity into these many, fractured sort of spaces of knowledge. No. But still, that is kind of how I function and how I like to think. And the reason I wanted to tell you this is because I hope to communicate the love of learning and inquiry and the pursuit of these existential questions in this channel. So much for now, and thank you so much for listening. This is Artis Vivendi, the craft of living. Until next time, live well and be courageous. Peace.